Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to tackle something pretty sensitive and complex. I think we're going to be talking about transracialism, and we're going to be comparing and contrasting that with transgender identity. So kind of a lot to unpack there. But to help us along, we have, I guess, a pretty diverse set of sources. We've got some Wikipedia articles, even a TikTok video, and we even have a YouTube video from Professor Dave Explains. So we're not here to judge anybody. We're just trying to understand.
Yeah, it's definitely a very, very complex topic. And even just starting with the basics of how we define things like ethnicity and race, the Wikipedia entry on ethnicity shows just how layered it is. It can be about language, nationality, culture, religion, or even physical characteristics.
Like, how do you even define yourself? Like, where do you fit in? I mean, like, I'm American, but I'm also ethnically Armenian. So we have our own language, a very, very long history,
Yeah.
our own cultural traditions, and of course, food. You know what I mean? So it's like, which box did you fit into? Maybe you fit into several.
Yeah, and then you have race, which kind of adds a whole other layer of complexity onto it. Wikipedia points out that while race is considered a social construct, there are real genetic differences between human populations that often align with those categories. So it's kind of like this weird paradox where it's both constructed and based on something biological.
So it's not as easy as just saying it's all made up.
Right, exactly. And the Wikipedia entry kind of highlights that, even though there are genetic differences, the meaning and significance we give to racial categories is socially determined. So, for example, like in Brazil, they have a much more fluid system of racial classification based largely on appearance, which, stands in pretty stark contrast to the one-drop rule that was prevalent in the U.S., where even a single ancestor of African descent could classify someone as Black.
Wow. The one-drop rule. That really highlights how random or arbitrary these classifications can be,
Yeah.
and how they vary so much across cultures.
Yeah, for sure. And, it really drives home the point that these categories, while they might have some roots in biological differences, are ultimately shaped by society and its history.
Okay, so we've got this like complex web of ethnicity and race, but where does transgender identity fit into all of this? We have this great YouTube video from Professor Dave Explains that he does a really good job of breaking down the difference between sex, which is biological, and gender, which he describes as a neurochemical construct. What does that even mean?
Yeah, so a neurochemical construct basically means that gender identity is rooted in the brain. It's about how our neural pathways develop and how our brains process information related to gender. So it's not just about our chromosomes or physical
It's
characteristics.
about how you feel and experience yourself internally, not just about outward appearance.
Mhm.
Right. And Professor Daves also makes the point that society's views on gender and sexuality have evolved over time. He uses the example of how greater acceptance of homosexuality paved the way for more acceptance of transgender people. It makes you wonder, could we see a similar kind of trajectory with how we view race and ethnicity?
Yeah, and that's where the idea of transracialism kind of comes in. It's a very controversial term, and it's often compared to transgender identity. But there are some really important distinctions that we have to consider.
Right. And to illustrate that, we have to talk about Rachel Dolezal.
Mm.
Her story really ignited the whole debate around transracialism. As the Wikipedia article explains, Dolezal is a white woman who presented herself as Black for years,
Mm.
even heading up a local NAACP chapter.
Yeah, and this is where things get really complicated. Dolezal claimed to identify as Black, even though she had no Black ancestry. This led to accusations of blackface and cultural appropriation, with many people arguing that she was actually harming the Black community by pretending to be part of it.
Yeah, it definitely sparked a lot of controversy, and it raised a lot of questions, like, can you really choose your race in the same way some people feel they can choose their gender? Are those experiences really comparable?
Right, that's the core of the debate. And to understand it, I think we really have to look at the historical and social context of race and racism, something that's often missing in these discussions about transracialism.
So how do those historical and social contexts differ between race and gender? And how does that impact the comparison between transracial and transgender experiences?
Well, with transgender identity, we're talking about individuals whose internal sense of gender doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. And, this disconnect can cause a huge amount of distress. And historically, transgender people have faced really severe discrimination, marginalization, even violence, simply for being who they are.
So it's not just about personal feelings. It's about this history of oppression and a fight for basic rights.
Exactly. And that's a really key distinction when we're talking about race. While there may be individuals who feel a very strong connection to a culture that's different from their own, they haven't necessarily experienced the same level of systemic oppression that's been woven into, the fabric of our society when it comes to race.
Right. You can't really separate race from the history of slavery and segregation and the racism that people of color experience every day.
Right. Absolutely. And that's kind of where the Dolezal case, falls apart for a lot of people. Critics argue that she essentially appropriated Black culture and claimed a Black identity without ever having to actually face the reality of being Black in America. She could choose to opt out of that identity whenever she wanted,
Okay.
a privilege that's not afforded to people who are actually Black.
It's kind of like claiming to understand the struggles of poverty without ever having experienced it yourself. It just doesn't feel authentic.
Right. It's about acknowledging the weight of history and lived experiences. There's a fundamental difference between admiring a culture and claiming an identity that's rooted in generations of struggle and oppression that you haven't personally endured.
So where does this leave us with the idea of transracial identity? Is it completely invalid?
Well, it's not a simple yes or no answer. I
No.
mean, the term transracial is sometimes used in the context of adoption, for example, where a child of one race is raised by parents of another. In those cases, it's more about the child's upbringing and cultural immersion rather than an individual choosing to identify as a different race.
So context matters a great deal here. It seems like the debate's still going on, with strong arguments on both sides. What are your thoughts on all of this? I mean, do you see the comparison between transracial and transgender identities as valid? Or do the differences kind of outweigh the similarities? We'd love to hear your perspective on this. It's a complex issue.
I think it's really important to approach this conversation with empathy and a willingness to try to understand different viewpoints. But what is clear is that we can't ignore the historical and social context that shapes our understanding of both race and gender.
Right. It's not just about individual feelings. It's about recognizing the power dynamics, the systemic injustices, and the lived experiences that influence how we see ourselves and how we see others.
For sure. And this brings up another really fascinating aspect of this whole conversation, the idea of genome editing. We touched on this earlier with the Wikipedia article. If scientists can modify genes that influence our physical appearance, could that further blur the lines between race and ethnicity?
It's crazy to think about. Like, imagine being able to change your genetic ancestry to match your chosen racial identity. Would that make the concept of transracialism more acceptable? Or would it just create a whole bunch of new ethical dilemmas?
It's definitely a question that pushes us to the very edge of our understanding of identity. I mean, we're entering a realm where technology is challenging the very foundations of what we thought we knew about race and gender and what it means to be human.
It's exciting and terrifying all at the same time.
Yeah.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back to something a little bit more, casual.
Yeah.
We have that TikTok video that someone sent in, and it takes a pretty simplistic view of race, arguing that it's all just a social construct.
Yeah, and while TikTok might not be, the most scholarly source, it does highlight how influential societal perceptions are in shaping our understanding of race. It makes you think about how much of what we believe about race is actually based on these external factors.
Yeah.
The messages we get from our culture and our surroundings.
It's like that saying, we don't see the world as it is. We see it as we are. Our perceptions are shaped by our experiences and our biases and the narratives that have been passed down through generations.
Exactly. And to really understand those narratives, I think we need to kind of delve into history. The YouTube video on the history of nations and racism is really helpful for this. It points out that historically people were often categorized by their tribal or regional affiliations, not by their skin color.
So the whole idea of dividing humanity into these distinct racial categories is actually like a relatively modern invention.
Precisely. The video talks about this guy, Johann F. Blumenbach. He was an 18th century German anthropologist who played a key role in developing the racial classifications that we still use today. And it emphasizes that, these classifications weren't based on any objective scientific criteria. They were heavily influenced by the social and political ideologies of the time, particularly the rise of European colonialism and white supremacy.
Wow, it makes you realize how much of what we consider to be natural or biological is actually rooted in these historical power structures and social hierarchies.
Yeah, for sure. And, this understanding is so crucial when we're discussing complex topics like transracialism. We can't simply dismiss someone's feelings of identification with a particular race, but we also can't ignore the historical and social baggage that comes with claiming a racial identity that's different from your ancestry.
So the very delicate balance.
Mm.
It requires a lot of nuance and empathy to navigate these conversations in a meaningful and respectful way.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to remember that this isn't just some intellectual exercise. These discussions have real-world implications for how we understand ourselves, how we interact with each other, and how we build a more just and equitable society.
So what does all of this mean for you? How does this whole deep dive into ethnicity, race, and transracial identity challenge your own assumptions and perspectives?
Yeah, it really makes you realize, these conversations about identity, they're always changing, right? As our understanding of science and culture and history evolves.
Yeah, it is a fascinating thing to see, and it really highlights just how important it is to be open to new ideas and to, challenge the assumptions that we make about the world.
For sure. So, we've covered a lot of ground here. We started with like the basic definitions of ethnicity and race. Then we went into, the whole transracialism thing and all the complexities there and the historical context. And we even touched on like the potential impact of genome editing.
hmm
What are some of the key takeaways that you would want our listeners to kind of walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest one is that these issues are way more complicated than they might seem at first glance. There are no easy answers. There's no black and white. It's about recognizing those gray areas, all the complexities, and really acknowledging that there are multiple perspectives on these issues.
Yeah, you got to embrace the complexity,
Mm.
right? Not shy away from it. And recognizing that these conversations are about more than just, abstract ideas. They have a
Mhm.
real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. And, hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about, maybe some new insights, or even, inspired you to do a little more research on your own.
Yeah, keep digging. Keep those brains buzzing. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode, too. What do you think? Do you see those parallels between transracial and transgender identities? Or do you think the differences are just too big? What really resonated with you?
Your perspective is valuable, and it really adds to this conversation that we're all having.
For sure.
So keep those conversations going, folks, whether it's with your friends, your family, even just in your own head.
hmm
These are important issues, and they deserve our attention and careful consideration.
Yeah, and that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Diving deep into these complex topics and hopefully coming out the other side with a, better understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey. Until next time, happy deep diving.